Welcome back to the GLEON Student Association workshop on effective science communication. So I'm glad to see that you're interested in learning more about these 3 ways to improve our science communication. So let's dive into the first guideline, which is tell a story. So what does that mean? So to start to get a sense for what I mean by tell a story, we're going to do a short exercise. So take a minute and write down something about yourself. It can be anything, but it has to be in a specific format. And that format will involve you filling in the blanks in this statement. Blank and blank, but blank, therefore blank. So, and just to give you an example, I'll say something about myself in this format. So my name is Ben, and I've given this workshop before, but I've never turned it into a series of videos. Therefore, I'm excited to see how you like this version. So it can be about your work, or it can be just about something about you in general. Now, if you're doing this workshop with others, please come up with your statement and share it with the other people that you're doing the workshop with. And please pause this video now to complete this exercise. Okay, I hope you were able to complete the exercise and share something about yourself in this format. So this exercise gets your brain tuned toward the very simplest version of what it means to tell a story. Now, this has been called thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's also been called opening, challenge, action, resolution. And if you've ever taken a debate class, it's also been called in debate, you say, I say, we say. And this structure is also often called the and, but, therefore framework. And of course, you don't actually have to use these exact words to generate the structure, and, but, and therefore. Instead of instead of but, you could use however, or instead of therefore, you could use so. But these words merely, these words could merely be implied by what you say in the structure. So it's often been called the and, but, therefore framework. I'm going to make it even a little bit more general and call it the context, contradiction, conclusion framework. So in the first part of this exercise, you set up context. You say something about yourself to give some background. And then in the second part, the contradiction, you say, but there's also another piece of information that kind of contradicts that context. And then lastly, you finish with a conclusion. You say, because of that contradiction, therefore XYZ. But yeah, whatever name you call it, again, I'm going to be calling it the context, contradiction, conclusion framework. It's the same thing, and it's everywhere. And it's very sticky in our brains. For whatever reason, our brains seem optimally tuned to take in and learn and remember information that is presented in this format. So let's see where this framework gets applied. So the hero's journey is one of the most common structures in storytelling in Hollywood movies and in your favorite novels. And it's just another version of the context, contradiction, conclusion framework. So in the hero's journey, a hero gets pulled out of the known world and into an unknown world. But there's some revelation which transforms this hero, therefore allowing the hero to return to a known world and perhaps a transformed known world. So this structure is basically at the heart of every Star Wars movie, every Lord of the Rings book, Harry Potter, almost virtually every Disney movie. They all loosely match this general pattern. And all those authors and creators must be onto something. And it's because they want their stories to stick in our brains, just like we want our science stories to stick in other people's brains. And the classic scientific paper also follows this same context, contradiction, conclusion structure. So the introduction provides the context, the methods and results sections provide the contradiction, and the discussion section provides the conclusion. And I actually want to take this structure even a little bit further and introduce what's called the narrative spectrum that was initiated by Randy Olson. Now, so far we've discussed the context, contradiction, conclusion framework as kind of identified by the words and, but, therefore, and how that can be very interesting or memorable. But communication can also be overly narrative. So here on the far right-hand side of this spectrum is the despite, however, yet structure. So when you have too many contradictions in a piece of communication, it can often be very confusing. And if you've ever had someone tell you that they were confused by something that you wrote or said, this could be one of the reasons why. Now, the opposite side of this spectrum is non-narrative. So here it's called the and structure. And it has a whole lot of context, but without an interesting contradiction. So if you've ever had someone read your writing or listen to a talk you gave and had the question, why should I care? You could be using the and style of communication. Now, we're going to be coming back to this narrative spectrum idea later in the workshop, but I wanted to introduce it here just to give you a sense of what it means. Now, I want to transition to the second major topic for this workshop, which is to focus on one thing. And to start to get a sense of what I mean by that, let's start with a short exercise. So this is the one thing exercise. It's part one of two parts. Now, without writing them down, please try to remember the letters on the next slide. And I'm going to say ready, set, go, and then give you 5 seconds to remember as many of those letters as possible. Ready, set, go. Okay, that was even a little bit more than 5 seconds. So take a moment to write down as many of those letters that you can remember. Okay, now the second part of the one thing exercise is going to be very similar to the first. So again, without writing them down, what I want you to do is try to remember the letters on the next page. And I'm going to give you another 5 seconds. Ready, set, go. Okay, so take a moment and write down as many of the letters in order that you can remember from the second part of the one thing exercise. So why was the second part of this exercise so much easier than the first? When the letters, if you'll notice, are actually the exact same letters in the first part as the second part. It's just that in the first part, those letters are all jumbled up. So the second part was easier because those letters were no longer in a series of disjointed pieces of information, but all those pieces of information turned into a single piece of information, a single thing that your brain can much more easily remember than those disjointed letters. So this has implications for how we communicate. So often we try to cram as much different pieces of information into a sentence, or cram information into a paragraph, or even cram information into an entire scientific paper. But to really write and speak effectively, cognitive load theory suggests that you really have to resist these urges to cram too much information into your audience's brain at a time. Instead, just focus on one thing. So focus on one thing in each sentence, focus on one thing in each paragraph, and focus on one thing in each paper, scientific paper, which you communicate clearly in the title. So in any form of communication, you have limited resources, whether you know it or not. So you may have a limit in the number of words you can use, like is often the case in a scientific paper. You have a limit on the amount of time you have, like in a scientific presentation. And your audience is going to have limits on their attention span. So faced with these limits, it's almost always to bet on just one thing instead of focusing on many things. So again, with these limited resources, you got to think of these green dots as arguments that you're trying to convince an audience to embrace. Here symbolized by getting those arguments across the red finish line at the top. So when you focus on many different arguments, it becomes difficult to spread your effort, spread your limited resources across those 4 arguments, and you might end up not getting even one of them across the finish line. But with the same amount of resources, if you just focus on one thing, you're much more likely to get that argument across the finish line and convince your audience to embrace the argument. And it's actually even worse than this, because when you try to advance many arguments, you not only have to spend time and space on, and your audience's attention on advancing each individual argument as a separate thing, you also have to spend those resources, that word count, those minutes, on connecting and linking and transitioning from one argument to the next. So those arrows even get smaller. In reality, there's this added benefit of focusing on one thing. To use a metaphor, pardon, it's a bit of a graphic metaphor, but it's always better to stick your neck into only one guillotine. Now, this is why it's better to focus on one thing in each sentence, paragraph, and each paper or proposal. Now I want to transition to the third guideline for science communication, and that is using shared language. So like the other 2 guidelines, I'm going to start with a small exercise to get us thinking about what it means to use shared language. Now, one of the best ways to make sure that your audience shares your language or vocabulary is to just stick to the most common words. Now, this is a comic from XKCD, and they made quite a splash when they came out with this comic, where they are showing a blueprint for a Saturn V moon rocket. And they explained its very many complicated parts and workings using only the first 1,000 most common words in the English dictionary. And the comic is huge. I'm actually just showing a small part of it here. And when this comic was released, there were numerous scientists across social media that attempted to take the idea and apply it to their own research. So they tried to describe, urban hydrology using only the most 1,000 common words, without the words like stream and river. Some tried to explain what paleomagnetism is without the word magnet. And it highlighted a central question in communicating science, which is how do you boil down research to a level that is accurate, but can be easily understood by people that are unfamiliar with a field. So we're going to apply this idea to our own field, where I'm going to ask you to explain limnological terms using the same 1,000 words from the most common 1,000 words from English. So if you were to try to explain what phytoplankton are, for instance, using only those 1,000 words, you could say something like tiny things living in the water that need light to grow. So what I want you to do now is to explain what an aquatic ecosystem is, also using these 1,000 words. So to check to see if your definition only includes those 1,000 words, please go to the link at the bottom of this slide, and you can type in your response, your definition, into that web page. And see, and it will check automatically to see if you've only used the 1,000 words. And if you haven't, then try to revise it. And the link at the bottom of the slide is also in the notes section for this video. Now, go ahead and pause this video now and click on the link and give it a try. I hope you had some success in defining what an aquatic ecosystem is using those 1,000 words. My rather embarrassing attempt is living stuff and not living stuff together in a body of water. But hopefully your definition was better than that one. So I'm afraid to say that sometimes we actually use unshared language on purpose. So the cynical side of me wonders whether academics in particular sometimes use unshared language because we even want to distract an audience away from a topic that maybe we're not super secure about. Or sometimes we use unshared language because we want to sound like, you know, a smart member of a group. But I really want to caution you against doing that because it can result in some pretty preposterous products from academia. So take, for example, this sample of text from Barbara Vinkin's Flaubert Post-Secular Modernity Crossed Out. So I'm going to actually read the slide for you. So the work of the text is to literalize the signifiers of the first encounter, dismantling the ideal as an idol. In this literalization, the idolatrous deception of the first moment becomes readable. The ideal will reveal itself to be an idol. Step by step, the ideal is pursued by a devouring doppelganger, tearing apart all transcendence. And this de-idealization follows the path of reification, or, to invoke Augustine, the path of carnalization of the spiritual. Rhetorically, this is effected through literalization. A sentimental education does little more than elaborate the progressive literalization of the Annunciation. Now, some of this unshared language might be useful to a very specific audience, but to most, and I'm sure to you, it can come off as pretty ridiculous. Now, this is where certain tools actually, when you come across communication like this, certain tools like ChatGPT can actually come in handy. Now, ChatGPT is an AI large language model that you can find online and ask it questions to which it can respond or make requests that it responds to. So when I went into ChatGPT and asked it to reword that text that I shared on the previous slide for a high school reading level, it came up with this revision. The purpose of the text is to show that the first meeting was just an illusion. It shows that what we thought was perfect was actually fake. Slowly, the idea of perfection is destroyed and the truth is revealed. This process is explained by using clear language and making the events more understandable. The text explains how the idea of the perfect moment is changed into a more realistic version. So now, at least this version is not perfect, but a little bit more understandable than the previous slide. Now, next time you're looking to make your own text more readable, you can consider a tool like ChatGPT to help you reach a broader audience in a similar way to what I've done here. And ChatGPT is not perfect. It's not for everything. It's not going to be a panacea, but it can be useful, especially when it's your own text that you're trying to simplify, because the output can then be checked by you for accuracy and thoroughness. So that concludes the theory part of the workshop. Now, please feel free to take a break before switching on to the next video in the series, which is part 3, where we'll investigate and explore the first 5 of 10 writing samples. So go ahead and take a break and then switch on to the next video.